we're going to talk about what kind of regulation is needed for artificial intelligence. And we have got a great set of minds here to wrestle this problem out with us. We've got, first of all, Chris Hyams, who is, until recently, the CEO of Indeed. And he is going to be taking the position that we need to regulate AI, and now, if not yesterday. We've got Shakeel Rashed, who works with a number of startups, including AI startups, and he is going to argue that we need to not move too quickly to regulate, lest we cause more trouble. And we've got Craig Watkins, who is the executive director of IC Squared Institute at the University of Texas and a professor, and he's going to talk about a hybrid approach that he is very close to himself. So I'm going to let each of these gentlemen introduce themselves for themselves. And I'm going to give each of you a short statement of your point of view on this question. And then we're going to dig in together and see how far we can take it and save time for you all. So be getting your questions ready about the kind of regulation that's needed to make sure that we achieve the promise without unleashing irreparable damage. Chris Hyams, how would you get our conversation started?
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks for Craig and Shakeel for being here. So, former CEO of Indeed, I left in June to work full-time on AI ethics. I'm teaching AI ethics now at Houston-Tomlinson University and HBCU here in Austin. And my point of view, so my headline, which I always like to say when I get the chance, I think responsible AI is the civil rights and human rights issue of our time. And I have sort of a couple sort of starting positions on this. The first one is that if you just listen to the folks behind the frontier models, the people who are responsible for building and shaping the future, every single one of them says that they believe this is going to be some form of the end of work as we know it. Not just, I mean, we just saw an org chart that looks like it has half the people that it had before, and they believe it's going to be actually even more radical than that. They also all believe there's a non-zero chance that it could end humanity. And so if we just take them at face value, that this is something that is one of the most extraordinary, not just technologies, but forces shaping the world. If we have any reason for regulation and protection, this feels like we should have more reason than for anything else that has come before it. So that's sort of the first point. The second one is that in democracy, I think in general, the way that our country was founded and set up was a series of checks and balances. And the purpose of regulation is checks and balances against the forces of completely unbridled capitalism, which, with all of the guardrails taken off, leads to the transatlantic slave trade and other things like that. So we need checks and balances. And I can say from my seat, as someone who ran a very large corporation, that companies' decision-making is shaped if one person who's at the top feels really strongly about something, they might do the right thing, and I've worked really hard to try to do the right thing. But by and large, that is not how corporations operate. They are driven by maximizing profit within the rules that are set up. And if there are no rules, that leads to things like the opioid crisis and the 2008 financial crisis. And so we actually need frameworks, and there's a set of arguments that the three of us have talked about this before that we'll get into for why people think that we shouldn't be doing anything. But my perspective is that there has never been a more important topic for us to be thinking about putting up guardrails for.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. So Shakeel, when I hear people say, argue against regulation, it usually boils down to there's no problem, there's nothing we can do about it, there's too much money to be made to do anything about it, and oh, by the way, we're smarter than you are. So I'm figuring I'm going to hear something from you that's more thoughtful than that.
Thank you for taking away all my points right there. And by the way, Chris and I agree on one big part of this, that this is a huge change that is happening right in front of our eyes. Right? This is bigger than anything that I have seen in my career starting in the late 80s till now. And I take that in a very respectful way of what is happening. But also the fact that is there with AI, I have never seen anything more overhyped than AI. right? So think about this. Whenever we talk about AI and AI regulations, what pops up in people's head? Skynet, Matrix, rogue AI, as presented in a number of fictional characters right now, right? So the hype in terms of AI, both to its potential for good and bad, has been overhyped, mainly by what I call unbridled capitalism or naked capitalism, right? We are all in this for the few who are racing towards total control, right? Who was the first one to go to the government and ask for regulations? Sam Altman from OpenAI. And you know why? Because it is to his advantage. One, the advantage that he has is it basically says, this is so huge, I need your participation in this, right? But it also overhypes his own position. By regulating at that level, he's actually working towards regulatory capture, competitive advantage to OpenAI compared to other people, right? So with that, the way I think about the AI regulation business is, one, there's a lot of overhype, both from the potential and good and bad. Two, the fact that there are a lot of laws that are existing today that take care of a number of mundane things that AI is doing. Is it about biases about hiring? There are laws against that. Civil rights, there are laws against that, right? Copyright laws, there are laws against that. Privacy laws, there are laws against that. So AI is not about new regulations, it's about enforcing the existing regulations along with new sense. What does AI enable people to do? We have been talking here a lot about autonomy, a lot about dissent, a lot about controls and trust, and that's what AI is about in terms of enabling that for us. And that's my position, and we'll talk more in detail.
Good.
I'll give Craig his
Craig,
part.
you've got some very close experience with an alternative model for trying to keep AI on good tracks. Tell us about it and about your point of view.
Yeah, sure. I don't completely disagree with either perspective. Obviously, right, this issue requires significant nuance in terms of how we move forward. So I'm a social scientist by training, an academic who studies AI via a research lab that I manage here at the University of Texas at Austin. And I guess before I make my comments, I want to just share with you a really interesting personal experience that I just had a couple of weeks ago, literally walking the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C., talking with congressional staff about AI policy and AI regulation. I wish I could say that I left those conversations upbeat about some potential decision-making and policies being passed. So this is sort of congressional season. They're in session. So as you can imagine, right, people shuffling in and out of offices, a lot of conversations, a lot of interactions happening. But what is clear, right, is that there is at least is a recognition that something should be done. Now the question is, can something get done? And we were talking primarily with them about AI safety, and obviously, right, some big news just broke last week in terms of Meta, YouTube, and some of the impacts that they're having on their consumers in terms of these products. So there's a wider kind of understanding, right, that as times begin to change and as the adoption curve of these technologies accelerate, right, in ways that you've heard here over the last day and a half or so, you were all likely familiar with before coming to Culturati 2026. But it's this rate of adoption, right, that is in many ways, quite striking. And so there's a huge trust gap in terms of the public's recognition of AI, growing awareness of AI, how we're being socialized to integrate AI into our lives. And yet, even as we're doing this, right, if you look at most of the polling and most of the data, right, most people simply don't trust AI. They don't trust the companies, right, who are building AI. And unfortunately, right, they don't trust our elected officials, right, who, at least in part, right, are charged to help manage and provide at least some safeguards and guardrails for how we move forward with this technology. So all of that said, there is an alternative perspective, right, that sort of fits in between what you've heard here, and that is this idea of sort of third-party verification, sort of independent verification. And so this is a model, right, that more and more organizations, more and more companies, large frontier AI companies are doing more and more kind of outside sort of independent verification. Organizations are also doing that as well. But it's this idea, right, of sort of building mechanisms that are designed to, in some ways, ensure that an AI system is doing what an AI system proposes to do, right? There's not what's called misalignment in terms of its goals, its vision, and then deployment, and what its potential impacts might be once it's released in the world in some shape, form, or fashion. And so, you know, the idea with this third-party independent verification, right, is that it's not simply just checking boxes, but rather, right, that you bring in real technical expertise to understand how these systems work, but you also bring in, right, expertise to sort of understand, right, what are the sort of impacts and consequences, right, as these systems kind of move through different organizations. So we just heard a lot about how AI agents, right, are not coming, but they're here, right, and more companies will likely begin integrating AI into their workflow, but at what stake and what are the risks, and how do they sort of build mechanisms to ensure, right, that these systems are performing in ways that they should be performing. But more importantly, and something that we'll hopefully get a chance to talk about here today is, you know, what are the sort of implications and consequences, right, of AI from an organizational perspective? And I would sort of highlight sort of three sort of broad dimensions which have very specific, you know, components associated with each of them. But that might be sort of operational, some of what we just heard about. Financial, right, obviously, right, there are huge financial stakes and implications associated with these systems. But there are also cultural implications as well, right, in terms of behavior, in terms of what's happening within the context of organizations. And so the degree to which you're bringing in expertise to sort of manage and to understand, right, independently, right, how these systems are functioning, how they're impacting. I mean, the idea, right, is that by having that sort of outside independent verification sort of approach, protocol, that you also begin to address this trust gap, right? And so that if you can in fact state that your system has been independently verified, that it is aligned with your values, that it is aligned with your mission, that it isn't doing harm or whatever challenges, right, you might be facing as an organization, it sort of emboldens your case. It begins to address some of these trust issues, and in some ways, right, provides a kind of direction in terms of leadership and how you might deploy moving forward.
Good, thanks. We've got a really good conversation here teed up. And Chris, I want to start with this question, because if there's really no urgency, if there's really no high stakes, serious harm, and time pressure, then this is an academic discussion. And you're the most thoughtful person in my network who cares about these things. And I wonder, how would you crisply get on the table the harms that you believe are most credible and worthy of our attention, and why you feel like it's so urgent to act quickly?
Yeah, thanks. I think the first thing to think about, so when we talk about AI, one of the things that's different about this from other technological shifts is this idea that it is a general purpose technology. So it is essentially going to impact every single area of society. Anywhere that a decision can get made, AI is going to be involved somewhere in making those decisions. And so if you look today, anywhere where we know that there are documented problems of bias, of inequity, but also, so you have housing, education, healthcare, criminal justice system, employment, all of those areas, decisions are made by humans, the decisions that are made by humans are flawed, that data flows into the AI models are not only built in and bake into that bias, but are demonstrated very, very clearly to magnify that bias because of the techniques that are used. But then we also have basically anywhere that there's an existing crisis. So think about misinformation and disinformation. And think about what social media did to amplify those and the impact that it's had on a global electoral scale. And then plug AI into that and the ability that we're sort of today almost at the point where you can't believe your eyes and your ears. So there's a handful of these areas, and I can go through the environmental impact, the impact on intellectual property and creative theft. I mean, my entire course that I'm teaching is just a series of these issues. All of these issues that exist, they're not new, but AI is turbocharging every single one of them. So the urgency is that we have problems that if we don't address from an accountability perspective very, very quickly, we're going to reach a point where it'll be a point of no return, and we won't be able to do anything to stop it. And frankly, the issue, so the only thing regulation is really trying to solve is accountability, being able to point out who is responsible when something goes wrong. And just because the question came up before, can we get a show of hands? How many people here are using AI somewhere as a hiring tool? Okay, so not that many. But all of you, non-zero chance that if something goes wrong, your company would be held responsible for the civil rights and the employment law violations that come as a result of that AI flaw. That feels like an unreasonable burden on people who have no depth of understanding to decide whether or not the tools they're buying actually meet some type of standard. And with no accountability for AI companies, it's going to fall on every single person in this room and their businesses when anything goes wrong as a result of it. And so what we need is, and again, one of the chief arguments, and we can sort of get into it, is we don't know enough about AI. It's true, we don't know enough about AI or what it's going to do. We do know the problems that we're trying to avoid very, very clearly.
And I hear you saying that when Shakeel argues that we've got laws right now that should be able to be enforced against the excesses that we're concerned about, what I hear you saying is they're going to be enforced against the companies using the tools as opposed to the companies producing the tools. Is that the claim you're making?
100%.
What do you make of that? I mean, that would argue that the real thing that we need is to shift accountability to the companies, and why can't we do that right now at this stage of our development?
So think about it this way, right? We are doing that one way or the other, right? So the pace of change that is happening within the AI universe. By the way, how many of you know that Sora from OpenAI is gone now? Right? Very few people, right? The pace of change that is happening within the AI universe is really fast, and there are things that are happening from these frontier companies who are taking responsibility for it. There are things that capitalism is working for, the free markets are working for. Getting rid of a tool that they spend so much energy on is something that is very important for us to acknowledge that they are taking that into the picture also, right? The other part of this is, think about it right now. What is AI? All of these companies are enabled by tons and tons of venture money, right? And the venture money is expecting returns for these guys, right? How long do you think, if they are able to pull out Sora, how long do you think we have till we get free AI for everybody? Right? There are so many questions that are there. I think one of our attendants here recently put on LinkedIn saying, when was the last time you wrote something by yourself rather than using AI? So we are getting affected from the cognitive decline also. Right?
So
there are
I
a number
agree.
of things there.
I just want to push back on this
Is that an
idea that
argument
we
against regulation?
No, that's where I'm saying there are lots of things from where we are moving faster than, and there are things from the free markets also that are taking care of these things.
But I want to argue about that. I want to argue against this. And I know that you will have a good answer to this.
Right.
But if we could go back in time to when social media was in its infancy, we could have put regulations that are targeted on that. And the same arguments were made, Shakeel. We got to let this thing take its shape. We don't want to, the government doesn't understand it enough to regulate it. And look at the irreparable damage that it has done to our society. If we could go back in time, we would hear the same arguments, and yet, with the wisdom of hindsight, we would wish that we had done something to prevent this.
I completely agree with you on that, right? And in our previous discussions, I brought up this point that social media is the Pandora's box, right? That opened up a lot of different issues, right? But think about this. Would Me Too movement have been there without social media? No, right? Would ALS Challenge, the ice bucket, be able to do 100 million of the revenue for that? No, right? So we focus on a lot of negativity on social media, right? But there have been a lot of positives also.
But isn't that the point
on
of
that.
regulation? The moment we saw that capitalism wanted to tune the algorithm towards constant addiction, that's the thing that we would have regulated against. We would have still gotten the ice bucket challenge. We would have still gotten the Me Too movement.
Absolutely, right? The algorithms are based towards engagement. That part is capitalism.
What makes you think AI won't do the
Right?
same thing?
AI is going to do the same thing, and it is doing it right now. It is doing it right now, right? But then as we move forward, there are other forces that will work against these things, right? The biggest one today is energy, right? How long can these dollars keep flowing into building these data centers and the energy and everything that goes into that, right? So there are forces that will fix this issue as we are growing. If you look at social media as an example, one of the things I say is with respect to social media, Section 230 that took away liability from a number of these companies for user-generated content gave birth to AI today, right? Without user-generated content, we would not have AI, right? So there are a number of interconnected things that come into the picture, and then the idea of regulations always come down to control, right? Slowing down we have been since 1995, 1996 when the Telecom Act was passed, right? We have been in the area of permissionless innovation, right? And yes, permissionless innovation always comes with positives and negatives. And we as a society need to adapt to that. Do I agree with you on the part that the accountability needs to go to the frontier companies? Absolutely.
Cool.
But how will that happen? It's going to take time instead of us pushing regulations on it.
Craig, let me ask you, you can make your own point, but here's a question on the table. I'm really excited about experts that could run third-party verification and watchdog operations for us. But in a sense, isn't that what Moody's was supposed to do for us in 2008? Without the teeth of regulation and government, the power of the state, can we really count on the market to use these signals to do what's right?
Yes, it's a great question, but I don't think it prohibits some consideration of how we design at least pathways of some sort, right, that move this ball down the field, so to speak, to use that metaphor. In other words, right, what can we do as soon as possible, right, just to begin to curve some of these challenges and potential threats, right, that are noted here. So something that struck me, this was about a month or so ago, was at a meeting with a lot of different AI folks, and a number of folks from the big AI companies were there. And one of the co-founders said something really interesting, right? And sort of when asked, kind of like, what's the goal of your company and your competitors? And the comment was, our goal simply is to build the most capable technology ever, deployed everywhere, so that AI is indistinguishable from life. And that's simple, but actually quite profound, right? And so the concern is, if they ever get to that point, and that's the current race, right? That's where they're trying to get to. We haven't talked about, right, the elephant in the room, which is China, and why they're able to do some of the things they're able to do, because fear that if we don't get there, China will, and what that might mean in terms of AI deployed everywhere, indistinguishable from life, most capable technology ever. And the concern, right, is if in fact we can get there, right, what are the sort of major issues that arise when literally only 3, 4, or 5 companies, right, are sort of driving what this will look like? Defining the terms, building the technology, in some ways, right, socializing us to sort of conform, right, to their vision of what this technology will look like, while they reap not only significant financial benefit, right, but substantial political, economic, and cultural power. And so I think this is, that in some respects might actually be the existential threat, right? And it's something, right, that I think is quite striking and something that is quite compelling we've talked about this, right, in an earlier conversation, right, that they built this significant, capacity largely on the back of data that's not their own, right? And so in many ways, right, they've created, right, this sort of massive kind of emerging economy largely around content, largely around currency, right, that wasn't theirs, right? And so one of the organizations that I do some work with, and who's a real strong advocate of this third-party independent verification is a group called Fathom. And one of the things that Fathom is really committed to doing and does a pretty good job of doing is sort of bringing different stakeholders into rooms like this, right? Around tables, doing a range of different activities that are designed in large part, right, to sort of expand the voices who will help sort of shape and inform, how the most capable technology humans have ever built gets deployed everywhere, and right, what's at stake as a result of that. And so if we don't have, right, that kind of a process, if we don't create mechanisms for that, if we don't create solutions for that, right, we run the risk, the potential existential threat, right, of these companies sort of amassing power that's unlike anything we've ever seen before.
Okay. You may want to respond to China or anything else you want to say at this point.
Yeah, so we're at a moment right now where I think the best sort of equivalent in history that I can think of is post-Manhattan Project. So the models that we're seeing today are nothing compared to what we're going to see, but we had just seen the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki prove the potential power. And coming out of that discovery of what was at the time the most powerful technology ever invented by humans, what we did not do is say, you know what, we are in a race with Russia, and we got to get there as fast as possible. So what we're going to do is open source nuclear fission and tell everyone to build their reactors and their weapons as quickly as possible with no guardrails of any kind. We probably would not be sitting here today if we had done that. And what we did instead was actually the largest international cooperation in the history of mankind. We haven't done anything since, like, 190 nations signed on to the International Atomic Energy. We created an international set of guidelines. It did not work perfectly. We still had, in my lifetime, 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl and Fukushima. But that's actually a lot better than where it could have gone. And we didn't know everything that this technology could possibly do in the future. And did we end up moving slower in terms of building out power? Absolutely. And that is a rational trade-off. And again, the whole point of checks and balances is having trade-offs here. And so,
let me ask you one more question, though, as we're headed towards time, and you're going to get your turn. Do you trust the American government to regulate AI?
I trust the American government far more than I trust Silicon Valley to do that. And I trust democracy to do it. So I wouldn't say you can't pick any two people in DC and say that they're going to do it. But if we actually have and the other thing that I'll just say very briefly, the European Union wrote the AI Act. They spent 5 years building this thing. It was passed in 2024. It's supposed to be taking effect in August. We're going to see what happens. I've read the 96-page draft. I think it's actually an extraordinarily well thought out. So to say that we don't know what to do, like, if we just took that and put that in place here, I would sleep so much better than I'm sleeping right now. And so I think that there's a lot of smart work that has gone into this, and we should just follow their lead.
Last word from you, before we give you one, too.
So again, right, atomic energy, AI, to me, that's, again, overhyping AI, right? So that's, again, we don't know whether it has that potential. Yes, there is a slight possibility of that rogue AI, uncontrollable AI, the God mode AI.
About people dying.
Right.
I'm just talking about the power of the technology, which everyone building
the power of
says.
technology, the way I think about AI, the power of technology, to me, the worst part is going to hit us in jobs, right? And I want to be realistic about the conversation on AI, right? I'm a big optimist about a number of things, but I can still think about the risks that come with it, right? Jobs, cognitive decline, bias based on the training that is there, and misinformation, right? We have come to the point where we as people are doubting every video we see right now, right? Which to me is a good thing. That AI has actually given us this capability that now I look at even a real video and say, is this really real? Right?
We're at time, Shakeel. I've got to give Craig one more word, and then we're going to have a couple of minutes for questions.
Yeah, I'll just say real quickly, and so we can wrap up here, is something that we didn't get a chance to talk about, but what's going to be really interesting, right, is how we think about, so we've talked about sort of AI sort of regulation broadly speaking, right? But internally, right, organizations are going to also have to think about their own kind of governance strategies for AI. So I spent a lot of time thinking about a lot of the issues that were just raised in the prior sort of presentation around the ways in which AI is going to change, like the content of work, what happens within organizations, the kinds of skills that will be required, and sort of building, right, a governance sort of mechanism to design for that, to understand that, to support that, to research that, and then deploy that in really strategic ways, I think will be really important. So the AI governance, right, isn't just a matter of what Washington, D.C. will do, which after just being there a couple of weeks ago, not highly confident, but there are things that we can do internally within our own respective organizations.
Good, thank you. We've got time for some questions, and as we're finding the questions, I wanted to say something that I'm learning from you all. We're going to have to make the government that we need to regulate something of this power. I mean, we're going to have to, this is going to be one of these moments where we are challenged to reinvigorate democracy. Because people that are stepping forward and telling us, get out of my way because I'm smarter than you are, there is a charitable way to view what they're doing, which is simply stepping into a leadership vacuum and saying, nobody else is running this show, the technology is emerging, just get out of my way and let me do what's inevitable. And I think people are going to do that until they see the rest of us showing up to use our influence, our intelligence, and that is costly to the rest of us. We have to engage the government, and this is going to be one of these moments, I think, where we are called to that challenge.
And if I could just make a plug, the current New Yorker, there's an amazing piece by Jill Lepore on the Claude Constitution, where she talks about, at this time of constitutional crisis that we're in, that we're essentially outsourcing constitutional decision-making to Silicon Valley, and it's an amazing piece.
And I want to add to that, right, in terms of what Stephen just said. Think about if you go for regulations right now for AI, the companies with the largest dollars will hire the best of the lobbyists to move it towards their direction.
Questions? Eric, you've got a microphone. Oh, no, you have a phone. Sorry. I thought somebody had the microphone back there.
Oh, yeah, okay. Trey's right there.
Anybody else?
Trey.
Trey.
It's a great conversation. It's fun to hear the sparring, and I think it's maybe the first time I've seen or heard a hybrid version of it in the middle, so I appreciate that. I guess my question for y'all is, it's a version of like, would you trust the U.S. government? I wonder, it feels short-sighted that we would just think about this in the perspective of the EU or the U.S. Why are we not talking about an NGO like a larger kind of CERN-like version of this? Where this is. I think we all recognize we're living in this global environment, and how might we go about seeking something that really recognizes the global society that we're in and what the global impact of AI is, instead of our own nationalistic and needs. I know it's competitive, but I'm curious if y'all thought about that.
So that's the IAEA argument.
Yeah.
I would love to see that. It's certainly not going to happen with the posturing of this administration, which is unilateral in sort of everything that's happening right now. But Henry Kissinger, the last thing he did before he died, he wrote this book called Genesis, and spent the last 2 years actually he was 99 years old and traveling to China to try to create a dialogue between the US and China about how can we work together on this. It's not clear where those conversations, they didn't land in an international cooperation, but I think there are people who are interested in that, and I think 100% we are going to need, if we're going to come out on the other end of this in the sort of utopian or just much better world that people believe that there's going to be, it's going to require an international cooperation at the level of the IAEA.
I'll add to that, right? International cooperation is a dream, right? It would be ideal to do that, but unfortunately, we are, like I said, a lot of venture capital money has gone into the AI systems with the we will capture it all mentality, right? So it's really tough to do that. By the way, Henry Kissinger's collaborator on that book was Eric Schmidt, who is, if they go with regulations, they would make it very much for their own competitive advantage, right? So,
Are there any other questions? Seeing none, let's thank these gentlemen for a good conversation.